situation in Hong Kong isn't de-escalating anytime soon. Australian businesses in Hong Kong are now making contingency plans if the situation in the city gets worse as protests block the international airport for a second day. And the questions of whether Chief Executive Carrie Lam has the autonomy to withdraw the extradition bill remain unanswered. We are receiving increasing reports of police brutality and claims by the Chinese regime that these protests are now classed as terrorism. What happens now and where's this all headed? Joining me now for his analysis is the Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Peter Jennings. Tell you what, it's really worrying. What happens now and how can Australia be involved for the greater good?
Peter, it seems to me that the protesters have a head of steam up, which makes it look like they're going to continue their actions. And moreover, they're very cleverly targeted. So going to the airport, I thought, was, from their perspective, a smart move to really point out just how they can bring the economy of Hong Kong to a standstill if their demands are not being met. I don't think this is going to ebb away, but I'm also fearful that it isn't going to end well. It can't end well for the people of Hong Kong. I think what Australia needs to do about it is to talk about it more, pay more attention to it, express loudly and publicly our concerns about the potential for mainland China to step in and create violence. And in other words, be what we claim to be, which is a good international citizen that stands up for human rights and appropriate values.
Well, let's contrast the tone of someone like John Howard, who said he found it inspirational, these protesters, and it is a big part of the population. We're talking 2 million people on the streets in a population of 7 million. So this isn't just a handful of rebel-rousers type thing. But then you look at Donald Trump, who has made it seem like these protesters are out of line and out of order, called them rioters and things. What sort of tone should the world be adopting? And if there is a Tiananmen Square style crackdown, what should our response be?
Well, in terms of tone, I think the best thing to do is to sort of go back to what we consider to be core values in Australia: democracy, human rights, the independence of the press and the judiciary, a restrained police force which do not go around beating people up. And I think we should simply advocate for those rights. So I'm sympathetic to Howard's position, and frankly I admire these protesters too, because I think they're in a very, very difficult personal situation. I am really fearful that we could see something that looks like a Tiananmen Square moment, which could happen when, from the Chinese mainland, the People's Armed Police, or even worse, the military.
And they're marshalling down near Shenzhen now, aren't they?
They are indeed. They're there on the border in considerable numbers, and indeed Beijing is quite publicly signalling that, you know, they would be prepared to go in if necessary to retain, as they would say it, retain order.
And the language is escalated. You know, the words like terrorism, things like that, give you a sense that they're marshalling the sort of the public rationale. Yeah,
they're building the foundations to explain why they might need to do this. But I think it could be terribly violent. And you say, well, what do we do then? I think we're going to have to be prepared to be, you know, extremely vocal in and working with the international community to say to China, this is unacceptable. You simply cannot engage in such military action against civilians or police action against civilians. So, you know, our penchant to want to sort of look the other way because of this important economic relationship we have with China, I think will not be sustainable if we have this situation where the People's Liberation Army or police actually march into Hong Kong.
So go back 30 years ago to Tiananmen Square, if you remember at the time, as I do, Bob Hawke basically gave an amnesty to people in Australia who were citizens who claimed they couldn't return for political reasons. 100,000 people from Hong Kong are living in Australia at any given time. 100,000 Australians are expats in Hong Kong. How do we manage all of that if it comes to be a level of conflict or a crackdown? What do we do about Chinese citizens who are in Australia who then fear themselves targeted? Because we know people have been attending protests in Australia in support of the Hong Kong protests, but they're now covering their faces because they fear the reach of Beijing into our own communities.
Well, what's even worse is we've had, for example, China's Consul General in Brisbane has been praising people that have gone onto campus at the University of Queensland to engage in aggressive behaviour towards those pro-Hong Kong students. We shouldn't forget that there are, as you say, 100,000 people of Hong Kong background, many of whom will be Australian citizens in Australia, who will be looking to our government for support and will be expecting our government to be open and to actually look after their interests. If it comes to this, I would be in favour of a Bob Hawke-style move, which would be to say, well, look, let's bring some of these people who will obviously need to flee Hong Kong if there is a crackdown by the Communist Party. There's one thing we can say about them, Peter, which is that they are Democrats. And so wouldn't it be a great idea to have more of those in our own country, people who care about democratic values and want to stand up for them?
And what about Taiwan and other countries of the region? How do you think they're viewing all of this?
Well, Taiwan is coming up to elections towards the end of the year, and I think that what happens in Hong Kong has the potential to increase support for the pro-independence parties in Taiwan, because Taiwan will be looking at this and saying that the old idea of one China but two different political systems is now being eaten away by Beijing. What we have in Hong Kong is not a separate political system. It's more like one China, maybe 1.2 political systems. And all of those freedoms that were supposedly underwritten at the British handover of Hong Kong are now being eroded. So for Taiwan in particular, but I think other countries on the periphery of China, the real concern here is, is might always going to make right? Is the military power of China always going to be the prevailing argument when you have smaller democratic societies like Taiwan? When I say smaller, I mean they're pretty much the same size as Australia. And again, my point would be it's in our interests to promote the interests of a democracy like Taiwan, because we're a democracy ourselves, and we would like to think that countries would come to our support if we were ever threatened.
Do you think we should be diversifying our trade base? We've been too reliant on China. Have we thought that the dragon was the sleeping dragon and never to awake again? Have we sort of been caught napping? Because you look at our reliance, particularly in the higher education sector, a lot of our minerals and resources. Should we be a bit smarter?
We should have been 20 years ago, Peter. I think it's a very bad idea to be over-reliant on any one country for your economic well-being. And there's a certain amount of laziness, I think, frankly, which has gone into...
Well, the rivers are coming. We thought they'd keep coming.
So why look for other markets? And in particular, our universities have been playing a game of 8 or 9-year-old soccer. They've all been chasing the same ball, which is the Chinese student market. They've failed to sufficiently develop a market of Indonesian students from many other corners of the world. I think this is going to become one of the really pressing economic issues of the next few years, is how can we quickly diversify to give us other options, that is to say options other than China. And we'll be forced into this situation because China is not the liberalising, pluralising country that we hoped economic growth would make it. It's actually becoming a more authoritarian country.
Particularly under the new president.
Especially under President Xi, in ways that we simply can't ignore any longer. And I think this is going to make it harder and harder for us to say that everything's fine in the China relationship, and less possible for government ministers to say, look, let's just not talk about this. It's unacceptable that anyone should be raising these issues because we're making money here. I think if we have a foreign policy that's genuinely built on our values, we're going to have to be prepared to stand up for those values, and that will mean reducing dependence on China.
Okay, just before we go, you're an expert analysing this region for a long time. Is there a time frame you'd put on this coming to a head?
I think it's been brought forward a lot faster because of the Hong Kong situation. So in other words... No,
I'm talking about the Hong Kong protest. Do you see them coming to a head in a week, 2 weeks? You think it's that imminent?
Yes, I think that is the case. There's actually a number of significant Communist Party anniversaries which start to come up in October. And I think President Xi would desperately want this situation to be solved by that time. So we're really talking about a matter of weeks really for President Xi to make a decision about are they going to go the heavy military or police way, or will they try to pull back for some period. I think that the idea of them pulling back in a restrained way is much less likely now.
Peter Jennings, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Peter.